the topic is most DePin projects don't actually need a native token. And I think Yash is going to say that, yes, that is true. They don't actually need a native token. And Shub is going to say, no, that is not true. They actually need a native token. So with that, I'll hand it off to you guys. Maybe you can give some insight on each of your viewpoints first.
I'll start. Oh, sure, absolutely. So, of course, if you look at the word DePin itself, the first word itself summarizes the nativity of the requirement, which is decentralization, right? So how can you not have a token for a project which the word itself says decentralization? Why would you not accrue the true value of the project in your own token versus give it to a third-party token or a stable coin where you are accruing the value of the entire project that you're building? So as far as the philosophy behind the decentralization go, you need to have, there are three key principles as far as I see the whole thing, right? You have incentivization model for the ecosystem to build. You have the right incentive that you want to be aligning with the long-term governance of the project. And of course, you want to be rewarding the right people at the right time with your own token. To fulfill all these demands, you need to have your own token in order to fulfill the project stability, the economic requirement, and as well as making sure the right incentives are aligned. So if you don't have your own token in place as a project for a decentralization concept, how else are you going to survive and build your own treasury out there?
Awesome point by Shub. Yes.
I think I here disagree with that, like issuing token equals to decentralization. Yes, it's the decentralization of the equity or the ownership part, but it doesn't mean that the network itself is decentralized. The reason being that in DePin, primarily like only 10 or 20% of the supply is circulating. So 80-90% of the supply is still with like the DAOs or with the team and so on. So definitely issuing token is not even truly a decentralization of the ownership when we first start with. Obviously, it's a progressive decentralization, but I think issuing token is decentralization is not the best way to put it here. And on whether they need a token or not, I think it's completely dependent. So if a token, it's also on the utility of the token. For example, if it's just a governance tokens, I feel all governance tokens are useless, or you can say they're just meme coins. So they are a speculative way to speculate whether that DePin project has a attention or not. So I would say it's an attention token if it's a governance token. If it has some utility in the form of, let's say there's a revenue buyback or burn, or some sorts of like, okay, it's used for some sorts of payment token in the network, then I think like then the token is needed. But if it's not needed, I would say like first start with USDC as the base pair, and if you want to track incentives or even incentivize contributors, you can start with points program and then issue a token. So I think like it completely depends on like what's the use case of the token. If it's just for decentralization, I think like it's just a meme coin, not a DePin token.
Awesome, awesome. So Shub thinks that decentralization means the project needs to have a token. Yash believes that without specific use cases, it's almost like a meme coin. So it's set up for...
I absolutely disagree to what Yash said over there, right? So we are talking about DePin over here, right? DePin can't be compared to meme over here, right? DePin has a fundamental value. It has a fundamental revenue coming in from the real world. We're trying to bring the Web 2 into the Web 3 ecosystem where we are essentially building something which is useful, meaningful. There is a revenue underlying over here. Now, if you look at the whole tokenomics that comes into this framework, right, it is essentially to build your initial treasury to fund the initial growth of the network. Bootstrap is the word that we talk about over here, right? So you're fundamentally using the tokenomics over there to fund your own treasury to build that. If you don't have your native token, how are you going to bootstrap the business, right? How are you going to bring the value to your project and build it over there? To the other point that Yash mentioned, right, using a USDC or a SOL or for any other matter, you don't have any control on the governance. How do you redistribute the value? You're redistributing somebody else's value. You're not redistributing back to the community members the value that you have built in the project, right? How do you make sure that happens effectively if you don't have a native token for the project? So if you are building DePin, you have to have your own token. If you're building for the long term, you have to have your own token. One thing that he highlighted about the mechanism behind the token, if it's meme, how do you justify that? So what is important is designing the right mechanics of your token, making sure the structure of your token is rightly incentivizing the participants of your network. So having a rightly designed token is the key for a good tokenomics.
Yeah, I agree on the rightly designed token part, but I disagree on the governance part. I think like most DePIN networks currently doesn't even need a governance. So if you see like the DePIN is consisting of two parts. One is on the supply side and one is on the demand side. Supply side is like how do you incentivize contributors. So it can be a native token or the stable formats like Sol or USDC and so on. And on the demand side, it's mostly like the companies or anyone who is just buying this contribution which supply side has put. So I think overall, like where do we even need governance? I think like that's the key part. On the supply side, incentivizing and all of that, okay, you can need governance, but I think like if you put governance here, most of the token holders are mostly degens. Like they don't even know what's best for the DePIN network. And as I said earlier, if 80-90% of the supply is with the team or the governance, then you can just like take the decision inside the team itself. Why do you even need a token when everything is that? And I think it's basically like start mimicking like a Web2 type style of board where there are like 5-6 people who are taking decisions. At the end, everyone is like just voting for the sake of voting. So even I would say like in the traditional equity, the voting is actually mostly a scam. Like it's just like 5 or 6 people in the board taking all the decisions. So yeah, I think like governance doesn't work. It's mostly centralized, and decentralizing governance shouldn't be a thing, whether we in DePIN or even in traditional equity. I think like smaller set of people always take better decisions, and that's the reason it is what it is. And on the token part, yeah, completely agree on that part, that if it's designed well, then it can be a very good capital bootstrapping mechanism. But I think, yeah, my stance is that if it's needed for governance, then you don't even need a token.
I'd like to counter that one. So he brought up the equity Web 2 part of side things. Let's take a Web 2 example. Let's talk about, pick any company, Reliance. Reliance as a holding company has Reliance Industries as the main share. Imagine if Mota Bhai used to, come back and say, no more of IPOs, and I'm going to be accruing the value of my new company within the parent company and do the IPO. How would that sound, right? So there is a logic, there is a reasoning behind why you have an equity that goes for IPO for every subsidiary company that you go and list out in the market. Because that's the only way you can effectively accrue the value for the shareholders that are participating. Now bringing to the same analogy into the Web3 things of frame, right? So in this case, these tokens that have been distributed with the right mechanism in place, which is the key to the whole thing, right, is essentially making sure the right participant at the right time are getting incentivized and they have the right motivation to build this business in the long run. If you look at the core fundamentals over here, in the DePIN model, it's not a 1 year, 2 year cycle sort of a business that you're doing. It's a long-term business that you're putting your efforts towards, right? You're talking about building for the next 5 years, next 10 years, and even beyond. If you don't incentivize the right people at the right time, in the right token, right, how would they stick around and make sure this project is a success? You will see either a meme cycle that happens and the project will die down and it won't sustain. Again, it backs to the same point, how it is designed, which is important, how much is the core holding, what is the mechanics, what is the unlock schedule, whether the project has a burn mint mechanism built into it, how does it effectively unlocks for the participants, and essentially who is getting the value back in terms of the token. Capturing the value of the project from day one in your native token and distributing that to project participants is 100x better than distributing USDC, which will not solve for your bootstrapping, which will not solve for right incentivization, which will not help you in any sort of DAO formation or governance. And of course, it is basically essentially you're saying that you are now dependent on a third party's success or failure that you would be running your project. What happens if you build on XYZ token and that tanks? You're also tanked now. That can't be your future where you're giving it out to somebody else and you're not dependent on your own fate. So effectively, to have a sustainable long-term view, if you're serious about building, you got to have your own token.
But what, like you said about incentivizing contributors, like you can also do dynamic distribution of USDC, and that's also real value, right? And if you are distributing your tokens, you are actually relying on the speculative value of the token, that tokens will be volatile and all of that. And if you want to do that even, like basically issuing your own token, you can initially have a points program. For example, you run points program for a few years, and like that's also a good way of aligning all your contributors. If they truly believe on you and if you truly believe in you long term, you can just do a linear distribution of points to tokens later on. that way they won't be exposed to a speculative value. And I think like that's what kills most of the deep in projects, that they distribute so much tokens in the first or second year just due to like their exponential distribution curves. I think like then like it starts killing up the killing the project itself. That it's highly dependent on token. It works well in the bull market when there's a lot of speculative attention and everyone wants to bet on new and shiny things. But when it's a bear market, the token starts crashing, and you have distributed so much tokens to your contributors for the as an incentives, and that now becomes worthless, and then the whole deep in flywheel like goes to zero. So I think like that's what has been killing most of the deep in projects, and few projects like for example Helium has been issuing like other sub-DAO tokens and all of that. Everyone starts issuing like a lot of tokens, and yeah, it's basically like I would say like farming your contributors.
No, fair enough. End of the day, it again boils down to how well your tokenomics is designed, how sustainable it is, how less mindless drops you have done in the beginning of your journey. That is very critical. But having said that, I still stick around to the point, having a USDC as a distribution mechanism doesn't solve for bootstrapping. Who's going to initially fund that, again, becomes a challenge over there. Whose capital then you're burning? There's zero capital formation happening for your treasury. On the other hand, if you talk about, having point system, I would rather have an on-chain mechanism to distribute those points. End of the day, points are nothing. Credit card points are similar to tokens, right? So end of the day, if I'm building in Web3, I would rather have an on-chain mechanism where I'm able to give the tokens. If the core philosophy is having point system only, it is no different from having our own on-chain token being deployed. That gives you freedom, that gives you scalability, that gives you the right sort of structure from day one, the right mindset to think in the long term and build the project in the right way.
Yep. So I think great points for and against, but maybe just again for the audience here, if maybe if you guys want to talk about maybe one project, right, Shubh, where you think that, okay, this project, that's why, and it could be your project as well, like why this native token makes sense, right, and how it captures value. And maybe, Yash, if we can take one project where you think that maybe they should not have had a native token, where, an underlying token would have worked.
I think we are not yet live, so I will not talk about the Dabba thing because we are still work in progress. We have not gone live with our mainnet, so would be the best time. This won't be the best time to discuss Dabba token. Let's pick up one of the most talked about token, Helium, right? So Helium has done some things right, some things wrong, and they are now going back to the fundamentals where they're getting back to the one single native token if we talk about, right? They have experimented with having sub-DAO tokens, they have experimented with, having other projects coming in under their umbrella, utilizing their thing. So what I could see from the outside and understand the ecosystem is they also realize that having one single token as a native token for the project makes sense because that's where the value gets accrued. That's where the essentially redistribution of the wealth that is getting created gets back to the core contributors of the project on a daily basis, right? Those emissions that happen, people have that liquidity, they have the visibility into what's happening, and they're able to participate in governance. I won't go into the sides of, who holds how much and who has how much voting power. That's for other time. But having said that, the core philosophy to have the value that gets accrued when the network utilization happens, when it's a burn and mint model, when there is the distribution is done right with a long-term view, it definitely increases the value of the project. It definitely incentivizes a larger audience out there to participate. If they were to, if people wanted to play safe in the sense of they did not have any risk appetite or they did not want to speculate or experiment with, they would rather go into the stable market and just buy USDC and probably Sol and other stable coins and probably stake them to get that APY. But that is not the case. People are here to participate where they are looking for good projects, fundamentally good projects that have a solid founding team, a solid backing from institutional investors, a good roadmap, a good vision to execute. People are much more happy to participate and contribute to those projects if they have a right token, because that's the only mechanism they see themselves getting rewarded back from participation, early participation. So I think it's very fundamentally important to have a solid, long-term divider, a long-term token that has been designed, and certainly the fundamentals have to be strong. Otherwise, no project will survive.
Yeah, agreed on the fundamentals part. On the against case for this part, I think like I wouldn't name a particular project, but I think like all the GPU providers or GPU networks like Render, Nosana, Ionet, and all of that, I think their token isn't much necessary. For example, on the supply side, we have all the GPU networks, and they're fairly stable. I think they don't need like tokens or anything to incentive. Like they just need like stable revenues because they have this like GPU and they have also a fixed cost here. So I think like they have procured this GPU, and if anywhere they go, they will get a good enough like stable revenue. So I think like they need mostly stable revenues, and in fact, most of these networks don't even utilize their token. Their tokens are just a meme coin, and they're using USDC there to distribute GPU providers. And on the demand side, I think like it's very clear that people who want to buy this GPU, they won't use a token, right? They would be, okay, like I pay $20 per month and I get the GPU. So I think like all these GPU networks, like for example at peak, Nosana was at $8 billion, Ionet at $5-6 billion. I think all of them like didn't deserve this valuation. It was just that time there was a lot of talk on GPU shortage in the entire world, and everyone wanted to bet on this. So it was just all speculation value. So I think, yeah, and this token still don't have like lot of utility. So I think like here we have perfect case of like why you don't need a token. You could have just used USDC, but at the end of the day, everyone wants to be rich, and token is the best way to be rich. So yeah.
I wish that statement was true. I would have rather, just started. Anyways, discussion for other time, not the time. Yeah, but yeah, fundamentally it boils down to how good your underlying mechanics are, how well it is thought through, and as Yash mentioned, like rather start a meme coin if you want to be rich rather than building the hard root of DePin.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So I think we have 2-3 more minutes before we, in our hands. So maybe before we move to closing statement, one final question, one particular thought on whether having your native token causes any revenue leakage in your native token versus the underlying, or does it cause any cost to the project, by having your native token, both for and against? If you guys want to share like a quick thought on that.
No, I don't think so. It's a leakage in the revenue. Solana has made it possible with its low-cost structure. Transaction fees are so low, TPS is high. So you have essentially a platform where you are not spending much. You're making it easily accessible, scalable, and sustainable. If you are building on Solana, it is the platform of choice without a brainer. So said that, if you talk about specifically about leakages, if you have your own token, you have a control on that. You can control inflation. You could control how far you want to be, what sort of distribution you would want to be doing over there. You can essentially build it for scale if you have that control. So I don't see a meaningful leakage in sense, but yeah, happy to hear Yash's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the tokens are definitely cost to the network. For example, whenever you distribute tokens, the contributors have two choices, either to hold that or sell that. And if the project doesn't have a lot of fundamental value, they will definitely sell the token, right? So I think like at the end, if your contributors is a speculative audience, then tokens might be a good choice here, because then tokens are used, there is a possibility that this degen audience or speculative audience buys even more tokens. But if this starts selling and there's a lot of sell pressure, then it's a cost to a network, because there are people who are holding tokens or who are buying tokens, and they're in a belief that these tokens would have some utility and this would be bought by the revenues generated by the network. So I feel that tokens are definitely a cost to network. It's not that, okay, you can just keep circulating all the tokens. So I think like, yeah, it's definitely a cost to the network. And on the leakage part, yeah, definitely like blockchain rails are very efficient. That's the reason that DePin exists on blockchain and not on any random other database. So I think like definitely blockchains are an efficient rails here, and you can use that to do that, but at the end tokens are cost to the network.
So any quick final counter or any quick final maybe thoughts before we wrap
Final
up?
is pretty simple. It's a straightforward answer. We need tokens. There is absolutely no avoiding that. If you're building for scale, if you're building for long term, if you're building for sustainability, you have to have your own token. The key is a better design, a thoughtful design token.